Okay. Well, first of all, I want to thank the Startup School folks for inviting me again. It's always a real pleasure to come here on mornings like this and chat with folks. And I appreciate you spending 25 minutes of your Saturday with me this morning as well. What I'm going to do is talk about something that we look for in startups, give you a little bit of a glimpse at one of the things we look for in startups that we want to be in business with. And the easiest way to sort of talk about it is to think of the metaphor of starting an inferno with a match. Now, one of the reasons why we look for this in startups is the history of companies that we've been fortunate enough to be involved with, is that the really great ones got an inferno started with a match. And in preparing for this presentation, what we did is look at some of those companies in a little more detail, and I'll give you a little bit of our understanding of that to get a sense of what it was about them that allowed them to do this. So first of all, the companies up on this slide, and there's some pretty big and fairly successful ones up there, got going on a very small amount of money. We used $2 million as a threshold, but some of these got going with less than $1 million. What's interesting is over the course of 30 years or so of investing in those companies, they've become quite large. This is not drawn to scale here, but on the right side of the slide, what you're looking at is the total combined market cap on the NASDAQ of companies that Sequoia was the early stage investor in, and it's not a typo, it's about $500 billion at today's value. On the left side is the total amount of early stage capital that all those companies raised. There's several dozen companies there. Now, normally I wouldn't talk about $264 million as a small number, but it is actually a fairly small number relative to $500 billion. Now, what's interesting is when we reviewed the companies that were part of that $500 billion of market cap, they were great P&Ls, there's no doubt about it. Fabulously profitable companies with growing revenue, in some cases like Cisco, huge revenue. But what's interesting is that they're really not known necessarily for their P&L. They're known for their greatness as technology innovators, their greatness as product innovators, their greatness, frankly, as companies. Think of Apple up on the upper left-hand side there. 30 years after its founding, is still causing the business of computers to rethink itself every few years. Or Google, or NVIDIA. These are companies, even after they got to scale, which were known for a lot more than just their P&Ls. Probably the most interesting thing that we learned in looking at these companies a little more carefully is that their leverage, their ability to start an inferno with a match, had really nothing to do with size. Clearly, they were able to do it when they were small. But when you look inside those companies, even to this day, in some cases decades after they were founded, they're still leveraging far fewer resources relative to their competitors to do really great things. So let's talk a little bit about why we think companies in the past were able to start an inferno with a match and what we look for when we look at new investments. Well, the first thing we noticed is that most of these companies throughout their life thought very differently about the market, about customers, about technology. In many cases, oftentimes, because they had to, in the same way that Amelia Earhart or Alfred Hitchcock challenged conventions in the 30s, or Jim Henson challenged conventions in the 60s and 70s. These companies challenged the conventions of their time, and to this day, think about Apple as an example, challenging conventions in the mobile business. It's baked into their DNA. The other thing about these companies, and again, this is not just the case when they were small. Even today, when we talk to the folks that run these companies, they don't throw money at problems. They throw ideas at problems. I had a conversation getting ready for this with Alfred Lin, who was the chief operating officer, who's actually also the seed investor in Zappos, was with the company for a very long period of time. And we were talking about the genesis of their fabulous customer experience. It's one of the things that Zappos is known for. And one of the things he said is, the genesis of that was actually partly trying to get more leverage into the business. In the very early days of Zappos, they didn't have any money for customer acquisition. And one of their challenges was, how can we maximize the revenue from our customers? And this is going to sound very simple and very basic, but the conclusion they came to was, we have to be the most fabulous customer experience company in the world. So once we have a customer buy from us, they'll always want to buy from us again. And it's an example where this leverage did a whole lot more than create a great P&L. What it did was create a much, much better company, in their case, a better customer service experience. The other thing about many of these companies is they started out with fairly simple, easy-to-use products, and they tended to leverage fairly small teams and focused on a fairly small niche of a market initially. This allowed them to be a whole lot more focused, and it allowed them to do things like ring the cash register very early, which, interestingly enough, in most of these companies, was less about generating revenue, because in the early days, the revenues were all fairly small. It was more about developing the right kind of relationship with customers. What they learned about their customers after they started charging money, and we heard this almost universally, was far more important than what they learned from customers before they started charging money. And I'm going to touch on that later on. The other thing about these companies is they were able to stay much closer to their customers because they were smaller companies. It's way easier to take a 5-person software development team and inform them about what's going on with customers. In fact, in many of these cases, important people on engineering teams actually travel to customers early on in life, something that would be very difficult to do if you were trying to run a 100-person engineering organization. These same small companies that were leveraging small numbers of resources were able to be a lot more agile, oftentimes because, frankly, they were smaller. It was easier to get folks' minds around changes in the business model when you were trying to re-educate 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 folks versus 100 or 150 folks. So what I want to do here is segue into, based on those observations of work we've done in the past, what we look for when we talk to companies about doing either seed investing or Series A investing in companies today. And first of all, I want to make a point here that it's not just about being small. Sometimes, frankly, as in this example here, you can argue that boat is frankly too small. And just like that boat out there, sometimes a startup needs to have a certain amount of mass and size in order to be a viable member of the food chain. And in this case here, he may not be a viable member for very long. It's not about being small. It's about doing more with less, in particular doing more with less as compared to conventional wisdom in your business. The example I'll use here is an example of a company that didn't raise a $200,000 or $300,000 Series A. Acades Power's Series A was well north of $10 million, yet one of the things that attracted us to this company was the huge amount of leverage in the model. What this company does is it manufactures next-generation diesel engines, and what it essentially has done is created the world's most efficient diesel engine, something that Detroit and other manufacturing centers hasn't been able to do over the last 20 or 25 years. What's really unique about this company is, even though they raised more than $10 million in their Series A, relative to what the rest of the business does in the way of R&D, they use a fraction of the resources. I was sitting down with the fellow who runs R&D for a major U.S. auto manufacturer, and he was talking to me about the number of engineers they have in their engine design facility. It's something like 20 times more than Acades. What's interesting is, and we were joking about this, they have the same number of computers. The difference, though, is their computers all sit on the desktops of 150 engineers. Acades has got 12 or 15 engineers and the same 150 computers in a grid sitting in a closet, basically behaving like a supercomputer. What they've figured out is how to use that computer to model engines, design engines, even test engines without ever having to touch metal. They did that, frankly, out of necessity because they couldn't raise $50 or $100 million. What it allowed them to do was put leverage not just into the business model, it's a highly leveraged business model, but into the engineering design process. Again, it's an example of a company that raised a lot more than a few $100,000, but I would argue is starting an inferno with a match relative to their incumbents. The other thing that we look for in companies is this drive to ship things early. It's really very important. It's not about revenue. Again, it comes back to getting that relationship early on with customers. You really don't understand what a customer wants, quite frankly, until you ship what you think they want and watch how they use it. With Apple, with Cisco, with Google, their early products were not even version 1.0, but they were enough to get engaged with the customer base and really figure out what people wanted. The other thing we look for is founders that put a price very early on the products or the services that they're shipping. Again, it comes back to this idea of until you start charging for something, you don't get real feedback from customers. A company you're going to hear from a little bit later on today, I think Brian Chesky is going to be speaking this afternoon, is Airbnb. And this is a fabulous example of a company that built leverage very early on in the business, frankly, out of necessity. I'm sure Brian will talk about the very humble beginnings of the company. It started out when 2 of the 3 founders couldn't afford to pay their rent. But what came out of that was this sense of leverage, this need to get out into the market very quickly. They began charging almost since day one for their product, and they iterate very rapidly. They try things very early on. They embody an awful lot of what we've seen in the past in highly leveraged business models. Last point I'll make here, we love ramen profitability. Now, that's not to say that the company that's ramen profitable is now on a trajectory to be a $100 million a year phenomenally profitable company. Oftentimes, ramen profitable companies that are about to be big actually become unprofitable as they grow. What this is about is founding teams and businesses where profitability can be a choice. When a company is ramen profitable, it's usually because the company made the choice to restrain growth and get to profitability. And what we love about that is it shows us a founding team that really understands the business. And oh, by the way, it shows us the business has real gross margins in it. And a company like that typically is way more successful and then investing in itself and becoming unprofitable, because at any point in time, they understand where the levers are, they understand where the knobs are. So we love companies that are ramen profitable. It's not always the case. Clearly in the case of McAdoo's, as an example, it wasn't. In the case of Airbnb, it was ramen profitable. I don't think this video is going to work here, but it's supposed to show you a little tiny guy taking down a big sumo wrestler. That is the ultimate result of building leverage into your business. What I'm going to do at this point now is I'm going to go ahead and open it up for questions.
What's the most surprising startup you've invested in? Like one you thought you were sure was going to be successful and then wasn't, or vice versa?
Well, you know, it's a truism in our business that they tend to surprise us on the upside and the downside. I think, you know, I can think of several examples. Companies like Pure Digital, which is the creator of the flip camera, which very early on in its life nearly died, and then went on obviously to become quite successful as a product company. That was candidly, even for the founder, a bit of a surprise that they were able to turn that around. Green Dot, which is a company that recently went public. They do prepaid cards, and it was a bit of a surprise for us. First of all, it was a bit of a surprise when they first ran into challenges as a company, and then they greatly exceeded our expectations when the founding team and the management team were able to pull it together. The truth is, most of the really successful companies that we're involved with, at some point they surprise us on the upside or the downside.
What are the big macro trends you're excited about over the next 5, 10 years?
I probably don't. The question was, what are the big macro trends that are exciting us? I probably don't have enough time to list them. I think at a very high level, there are two really big changes going on in the world of IT right now. First of all, consumers are completely rethinking how they interact with IT. 10 years ago, the most interesting thing, a piece of data that a consumer owned, probably sat on their laptop. Didn't even sit on their phone. They probably didn't have a phone that had data capability. 10 years from now, very little of the information that people care about is likely to be stored on their phone or their computer. It's probably going to be up in the cloud. And over the course of that 20 years, massive structural changes are going to happen in how IT services are delivered, not just to consumers, but to organizations that work with consumers. The other big thing that's absolutely fascinating to us is how information technology infrastructure is organized. Looks like it's about to change in a way where it has not changed perhaps in the last 15 years. 15 years ago, the idea of something called client-server was a revolutionary idea. Putting enterprise-class applications onto a little tiny server was something nobody did. Today, this is how corporate IT operates. In the same way, a cloud-based infrastructure, and I'm not just speaking about things like Amazon S3, I'm talking about as an architecture, the idea of a virtualized, distributed, geographically dispersed cloud. This is something that most folks would not put traditional sort of corporate infrastructure on. 15 years from now, it will probably be like client-server computing. It will be assumed that's how you do it. Those two trends are probably going to fuel a huge amount of company building opportunities, we think, in the next few years.
What's your take on the
You know, you guys know what I know. I read the same, I read the internets, as they say. I guess what I'll say is, look, they're horrible allegations. I hope they're not true. If they are true, I hope it stops. The bottom line, it reminds me of an important point about this business. You've got folks who sit on different ends of the spectrum, and I don't care whether they call themselves angels or VCs or whatever. You've got folks who think of themselves first and foremost as company builders who happen to invest in companies that they help build. That's one end of the spectrum. I think Sequoia fits on that end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum are, frankly, just investors. And they tend to do things like innovate in interesting kinds of term sheet structures and what have you. And I would argue that the vast majority of the great companies that I showed you up there, they were a result of founders working with company builders over long periods of time. And this whole sort of super angel controversy, if the allegations are true, what it reminds me of is that there are some angels that we work with that are clearly company builders. We work with them over and over again, and some of them are sitting in the audience here, I see. And there are, unfortunately, probably angels that fit more on the spectrum of investors who try to sort of innovate with term sheet and other sorts of mechanisms.